And this is going to be about climate justice and democracy, authoritarianism, masculinities, and justice challenges in rural development. And I have to say that while I've always been interested in questions of justice, these issues of democracy and authoritarianism have not always been so central to my research. But then over the years, it became more and more central. And I think that these visualizations by the Varieties of Democracy Institute justify well the reasons why. Actually, they show that the advances in global levels of democracy have been totally wiped out in the last decades. So, for example, while in 2002 there were 13 countries in the process of becoming authoritarian, in 2022 there were more than 3 times more. Astonishingly, in 2022, 72% of the world's global population, some 5.7 billion people, were living in autocracies. And of course, one can question how these assessments are made. I can see it on your face. What counts as authoritarian and what counts as democratic? I'm not doing that. Rather, in my research, I try to understand the processes through which authoritarianism and democracy can come about, and in particular, the role climate change, rural sustainability, environmental politics play in these processes. But of course, you may ask, what has authoritarianism to do with rural development and climate change politics? And actually, there's an increasing scholarship looking at these connections. There are different, these different scholars call their scholarships in different ways. There's far-right ecologism, far-right environmentalism, authoritarianism and the environment. Others talk about authoritarian politics and the rural world. Some focus about petro-masculinities. I myself like to talk about green authoritarianism to encompass more than just this specifically far-right context, and to try to refer to those democratic deficits that may emerge from processes of transitioning away from a fossil fuel economy. But no matter what the denomination is, here are the main pieces of this puzzle as I see it. So right-wing authoritarianism, fossil fuel systems, but even as Gustavo Romeo, Melissa Argento, and Jonathan Nunez call it, accumulation by defossilization, so this process of getting away from the fossil fuel economy. And the third piece of the puzzle is white patriarchal rule, which I'm going to start talking about. So let's start with this. And we all know that for many years now, the climate change discourse has been dominated by this technical, so-called scientific framing based on modernist and masculinist notions of objective knowledge, science, control, predictions, and efforts at reducing uncertainty. Men and a few women travel regularly across the globe to try to find solutions to climate change, and in majority the solutions that they envisage to climate change are technocratic, market-based, and related to a security framing. So think about carbon capture, carbon sequestration, geoengineering. But climate politics has become masculinized as a result of this science and security framing to understanding climate change. And as a feminist environmental scholar, Sherilyn McGregor, puts it, these hardened framings of climate change result in a preference for the kinds of solutions that are the traditional domains of man and hegemonic masculinity. masculinity, as classically defined by Connell, as a socially constructed identity that emerges within a gender order that defines masculinity in opposition to femininity. This is an important part, and in so doing sustains a power relations between men and women as groups, as well illustrated by these yogitis, both in a grocery shop in Sweden. So you have women's tea is full-bodied, inspiring and fruity, and men's tea is strong, down to earth, and of course, spicy. All right. According to researchers Martin Holtman and Jonas Anselm, we live in the era of eco-modern masculinities, a practice and a discourse adopted by men, women, governments, policies, which recognizes global climate change, but the main solutions, as I already mentioned, that are envisaged in response to the effects of climate change are these technocratic and market-based solutions. For eco-modernists, there is no conflict between economic growth and solving environmental problems, as these technological solutions, often private and market-based, would resolve any difficulties. But Holtman and Ansel also ask, what if the way we do this quest towards these large-scale solutions, such as carbon capture, geoengineering, was the actual problem? It might also be that if the eco-modern masculinity dominates as much, we may not be able to see other types of solutions, such as, or recognize other solutions, such as permaculture, the recycle economy, collaborative economy, things that have to do with care and commoning, and that to be recognized as more affective, more feminine, and therefore deemed to be possible only at a small scale. So today, eco-modern masculinities dominate global climate change debates and permeates climate science. In the era of eco-modern masculinities, toughness, determination, and hardness go together with well-chosen moments of compassion, vulnerability, and eco-friendly technology. Think about electric cars, and they appear as the ultimate win-win figuration. But in reality, this eco-modern era seems to be also a continuation and even maybe a cover-up to continue down the same modern industrial path that created the problem of climate change in the first place. And within this industrial path, we find the industrial modernization discourse and the dominance of industrial masculinities, think Donald Trump, which have been quite successfully denying the research findings regarding climate change. And while industrial masculinity portrays nature as a resource to be tamed by masculine forces, in the era of eco-modern masculinities, nature is portrayed as alive and in need of the care of the market. In both cases, you see the continuity. Nature thus becomes something possible to dominate with masculine practices. So it is important to understand how particular man and specific constructions of masculinities are inserted into and shape the climate change agenda and climate science. And ultimately, we need to bring to the core of the climate change debate the idea of ecological masculinities, so masculinities that would go hand in hand with climate change adaptation, as well described in this amazing book by Holtman and Poley called Ecological Masculinities. So this was the first piece of my puzzle, and let's bring back the two remaining ones and explore how patriarchal rule, fossil fuel systems, and the rise of right-wing authoritarianism may be connected. So Kara Daggett identifies petro-masculinity as a reactionary stance to eco-modern she explains that patriarchal-masculinity is a stance that aims to defend the endangered status quo, in which burning fossil fuels becomes a reassertion of white masculine power on an unruly planet. An unruly planet that is perceived to be increasingly in need of violent authoritarian order. And when she says burning fossil fuels here, it also includes these efforts, these large-scale efforts at transitioning away from the fossil fuel economy through, for example, mining lithium for electric car batteries and all these large-scale solutions. Okay, so do you know what these gentlemen have in common? No, they are. Yeah. No. Okay, they have many things in common, but they are also the representatives of our eco-modern era, illustrative embodiments of patriarchal-masculinity. They are also the heads of political regimes that share the following features: nationalism, justified in the name of vulnerable groups, who are ought to be protected, or to the contrary, to be afraid of. Another feature of these regimes are the demonization of supposed enemies, the support for authoritarian leaders who rise to power by exciting fears and promising to protect the nation, a nation that is framed in an exclusionary manner. Some ought to belong to it, some don't. And also these regimes are characterized by direct attacks implemented on democratic norms and institutions, more related to the environment, often. Within this context, authoritarianism often arises from the tensions between rural and urban areas. There's also exploitation of national natural resources in order to buy political support. And sadly, environmental activism and research is often silenced in this context. So now, in the remaining part of my talk, I would like to illustrate some of the ways in which this puzzle manifests in the real world, in the places where I do research, Hungary and Nicaragua. And this is not a comparison, I don't do comparisons, but the two cases speak well to each other. First of all, because of their differentiated positioning on that imaginary scale between authoritarianism and democracy, but also because of their similarities, such as their geopolitical alliances with Russia and China, the fact they have ethnic minorities, Roma populations in Hungary, indigenous populations in Nicaragua. In both places, environmental movements and NGOs have been weakened or expelled, and in both places, political and economic elites are strategically positioned in the agriculture, environmental, energy transition sectors. There are big differences, of course, there are many, but are the fact that Hungary is a post-socialist state, an EU member, Nicaragua has a history of colonization, and Hungary likes to describe itself as an illiberal state, whereas Nicaragua purports to be a post-neoliberal state. I'm not sure Herman is here, he won't like what I'm going to say, but in my analysis, I try to go beyond Western liberal understandings of democracy, so beyond questions of equal representation, beyond questions of civil rights and liberties, beyond the rule of law, beyond separation of powers, and beyond multi-party elections. And while I don't disagree that these may be important aspects, I try to bring in other understandings of democracy, two other important understandings of democracy. The first one, in line of the feminist political ecology understanding of democracy as a process of building equitable, just, and caring relations with humans and non-humans. And the second one following environmental political theorists as an agonistic process, democracy as an agonistic process in which political conflict can become opportunities for democratic renewal through political struggle and contestation. So my examples, and first we're going to go to Hungary. In Hungary, our recent research with my colleague Péter Bori has shown that unequal land relations, EU subsidies, agricultural commodity sales, and renewable energy constitute the 4 rural pillars of authoritarianism. And I'm going to try to walk you through very quickly these pillars as examples. There's more nuances, but I don't have the time to go into too much detail. So concerning the first pillar, unequal land relations. So it's important to understand that rural inhabitants are the main voters of Prime Minister Orbán's Fidesz party in Hungary, who won the elections in 2010 by pledging to stand up for the rights of smallholder farmers who at that time were facing some land grabbing related conflicts. So in 2010, Orbán strategically used some land grab related conflicts to win rural voters. At the time, he exposed the so-called pocket contracts that helped foreigners acquire land in Hungary despite a moratorium on land that existed at that time. So Orbán's political campaign made exceptional efforts to rally rural communities. The political campaign at that time included the proposal of a rural development strategy that we would all here qualify as transformative. Indeed, the strategy was supposed to support smallholder farming by leasing out state-owned land to young Hungarian families who would be ready to settle in and revitalize the countryside. And this was possible at that time because as a legacy of socialism, at that time the Hungarian state had still a lot of agricultural land in its hands. However, this nice rural development strategy was never implemented. It ended up in a dustbin. It was only aimed at winning some strategic rural votes. And later, in 2014, 18, 22, Orbán did not need that trick anymore, as among other things, the electoral system had been changed in such a way that it is very, very difficult for Orbán now to lose the elections. So this was in 2010. 5 years later, in 2015, the government got rid of that great quantity of agricultural land it still owned through a so-called very quick thunderstorm land privatization process that contributed in a very, very short time to decreasing the number of small farms by 30%. Privatizing Hungarian agricultural land in 2015 happened exactly, guess what, during the so-called refugee crisis that kept Hungarian people's minds occupied, thanks to the government anti-refugee campaign. So on the corner of this slide, you can see the types of propaganda banners the streets of Hungary was full of that summer of 2015 when the thunderstorm land privatization process happened. The land privatization was meant to please the regime's oligarchs, these political and economic elites that support the government. Guess what? Oligarchs are not interested in farming. They have two main reasons why they're interested in agricultural land. The first reason is a long-term reason. speculation on land prices. The second one is a short-term reason, and it is related to the second rural pillar of authoritarianism in Hungary. It's EU subsidies. Indeed, the common agricultural programs, subsidies, and especially the area-based subsidies are really interesting for these oligarchs as a source of income while waiting to maybe sell their land at a good price. Another legacy of the socialist times in the agricultural sector in Hungary are the so-called integrators, which constitute the third rural pillar of authoritarianism in Hungary. So integrators are these companies that supply farmers with inputs such as seeds, manure, fertilizers, and subsequently purchased post-harvest produce from them. These integrators are now owned by the country's wealthiest people, oligarchs, who are close also to the government. About a year ago, while doing fieldwork in Hungary, I realized that there was a fourth pillar to authoritarianism, and it had emerged over the years. Actually, many of the former agricultural lands grabbed by the oligarchs were not left fallow anymore. They were covered by solar panels. The renewable energy sector has become a political and economic opportunity for the state as well as for politically connected oligarchs. And we see the same oligarchs that bought agricultural land, that got access to agricultural land, now buying up electricity companies and investing, getting access to these companies that produce solar energy. Okay. Now, let us go to a very different context for just 2 slides, where the processes are, I'm going to focus on some different aspects of these processes, but actually there are quite some similarities of what was happening in Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega, the president, has been elected in 2017, and Ortega is today, Nicaragua is today a very violent dictatorship, especially since 2018, after the 2018 insurrections. So with colleagues from Nicaragua, we have recently looked at a major climate change mitigation program called Bioclima that got funding in 2020 by the Green Climate Fund. Bioclima's aim was to reduce deforestation and strengthen resilience in biosphere reserves in Nicaragua. So in our research, we have zeroed in on Mayagna indigenous communities whose ancestral territory overlaps with the biosphere reserve of Bosawas that is marked with red on the map. We need to know that Bosawas is a place of intense conflicts between indigenous people and non-indigenous settlers who are originally from the more Pacific Ocean side of the country, where the conditions in terms of climate, land degradation, and land concentration have become increasingly harsh for implementing cattle ranching, for example. So these non-indigenous newcomers come to the indigenous territory, which overlaps with the biosphere reserve, to find pastures for which they destroy the forests. These newcomers also often engage in timber extraction, and while not officially, these non-indigenous settlers are supported by the government. Indeed, they help to push the agrarian frontier further, thus opening up the territory for mining and timber extraction, in which the government is also interested. So in our article published in 2023, we discuss how complex relations between the authoritarian state, people, and nature, relations that are characterized by both conflict and collusion, are instrumental in creating the openings wherein right, caring relations can emerge, even within this context of authoritarianism and conflicts. And these right and caring relations are very much at the basis of democracy, as I stressed when sharing with you my understanding of democracy just a few slides earlier. So at the local level, the Bioclima project presented a clear threat for Mayagna indigenous peoples' autonomy and their environment, including the Bosavas Biosphere Reserve. But in the communities, one strategy by the indigenous Mayagna to be able to remain in place and maintain autonomy was precisely to develop caring relations with non-indigenous settlers. So we have observed, for example, settlers form unions with Mayagna women, purchase goods from community markets, establish trade relationships with Mayagna, and settler youth attend Mayagna baseball games. Mayagna women, at a workshop discussion, saw the creation of these new to somewhat caring relations as necessary, in part due to the fact that Mayagna families are now a minority on their own territory, and partially because they have no support from state authorities. Crucial to this understanding is how these actions are grounded in economic need, political marginalization, but also a deep desire to avoid more conflicts and greater suffering. Another example of reworking relations towards autonomy is from a Mayagna community where Mayagna indigenous people have agreed to self-regulate land use. So faced with the pressure from settlers and the continued lack of state protection on their behalf, they allocated 1/3 of their territory for lease to settlers, but with differentiated rates for land in order to reverse deforestation while encouraging a shift to agroecology. So as Mayagnas insist on their rights to decide over their territory, they strengthen indigenous autonomy and the potential to wear away at authoritarian processes. So this was the message I wanted to convey to you and show how trying to map the power connections in the ways I'm trying to do across actors and scales allows for exploring the processes through which authoritarianism and democracy can emerge. And to close this talk, I just want to reiterate how important it is to recenter the question of democracy within our debates on climate politics, environmental governance, and my hope is that by understanding better these processes, we can prevent ourselves to further sleepwalking into authoritarianism. Thank you very much.